Thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure to participate in this meeting. Quite unusual, I suppose, for a company of our nature to be dabbling in an area called psychedelic and bioregenerative. And what I want to discuss essentially is two areas of our work. The first is naturally the more exciting, which is our work on the cell-based psychedelics. And the second, while a little bit more mundane, may have more longer term implications for long duration space travel. And that's our activities in the bioregenerative agriculture space. Next slide, please. Essentially, we're an industrial biotechnology company. We focus on developing sustainable algae and mycelial-based solutions for the planet's most serious challenges, which we regard as being in the nutrition area, the agricultural area, and in health and wellness. And what we seek to do is essentially find roles for microbes, mainly microalgae and mycelia, in meeting these challenges. Next slide. So some of the things that we do on the nutrition side is essentially we produce, using proprietary technology, a range of algae and mycelial extracts. And this serves the plant-based food market. And one of our latest products has been an algae-based heme analog, a competitor to the GMO Impossible heme. And ours is really designed to be much more sustainable, zero waste, and in keeping with our commitment to the circular economy. Next slide. We also have a substantial activity in agriculture, and it's the agriculture that led us into both the psychedelics and the bioregenerative space. And that is essentially in the production of biostimulants, and you can see the hand is pouring a blue liquid, and that's our A601 biostimulant. Biostimulants are natural ways of increasing productivity. They improve yield, shelf life, the amount of flavonoids, etc., in plants. And our focus has been really on vertical farming. In other words, improving yield, especially in vertical farming. And that's a direct answer to the sustainability issues in vertical farming. Next slide. What we're interested in long duration or long distance space travel is the fact that there are problems. There are problems, and the problems are summarized in what's called the human exposome. In other words, astronauts or voyagers in space have a whole range of issues that they have to face: radiation, changes in gravity, the hostile environment, the interpersonal issues, the distance from Earth, the isolation and confinement. And there is quite a substantial literature on this exposome. And we look at it exclusively as, okay, well, it's an issue, like improving nutrition is an issue, and what can we do to help? Next slide. Well, to us, the whole issue of the long distance traveler exposome is not new. And we think that the most interesting analogy is that of scurvy. Scurvy was a debilitating disease that largely contributed to a huge amount of huge barriers in global marine travel and exploration and trade in the 17th century. And it was essentially a disease which was the human exposome to long duration sea travel. And what happened there is that a physician called Lind did the world's first randomized trial. And he worked out that if you give the sailors oranges and citrus fruits, they did not suffer from scurvy. And so to us, the issue is, what is the answer? What is the answer to the scurvy of long duration space travel? We're fascinated by that, because we don't think that many of the issues in long duration space travel are going to be essentially nutritional. They're largely going to be psychological. And what could we do from a nutritional point of view to deal with these? Next slide. Well, let's get back to the interesting stuff, which is the psychedelics. McKenna claims, and there seems to be some evidence, that essentially our hominid ancestors were roaming the plains of Africa, saw these little mushrooms growing in animal dung, ate them, and that was what contributed to us becoming what we are today, for good and for bad. I need to remark. Essentially, the story is a little bit more complicated, because it may not have only been the fact that it changed our encephalization, the eating of these psychedelic mushrooms, but also that our hominid ancestors may have been eating these mushrooms for other reasons. In other words, to get the tryptophans, because they were still very much unable to be a hunter-gatherer society yet and they were not hunting. So they needed some source of tryptophan and tryptamine for this encephalization process, and they were eating these mushrooms, which are rich in tryptamines. Psilocybin is essentially tryptamine, and there are other sources of tryptamines within the mushrooms. Next slide. So, this may sound like a completely weird theory, and what makes it even weirder is the fact that most of the interest in space medicine is around diagnosis and curative interventions. And it was nice to read what Paul Stamets said when he said that NASA should be considering the psychedelic mushrooms. In other words, having astronauts on a trip as part of the psychological toolkit for the challenges challenges of solitude and isolation in space. Next slide. Well, how does this connect to what's going on Earth? And I think that we're all fully aware of the fact that we have a huge sustainability challenge on our planet. Next slide. Well, our view is that there is a link, and that the whole link is that, and this is what we work on, and we have a number of these pilot projects ongoing with large, mainly vertical farms, and we can establish a link between food waste and aerobic digestion and other methods of digestion, production, cell-based production of food, extraction of various molecules of interest, and using those in things like vertical farming, cellular agriculture, and primary and secondary metabolites. And with this, we can produce what we need in space. And to us, this is the whole basis of a circular bioregenerative approach to nutrition and psychedelics in space. Next slide. So what's the connection with cultured meat? Next slide. Well, these things which we produce, the algae, the mycelia, etc., are essentially what's regarded as the foundation of making the production of cell-based, lab-grown, cultured meat possible. And you need to go back to the very beginning, which is the work of Hannah Tuomisto, who basically established the first model of the viability and the huge positive environmental impact of cultured meat, based on a model which used algal hydrolysate, spirulina hydrolysate. Now, what's interesting about this is, to date, nobody has ever proved Hannah Tuomisto's model, and our claims that cell-based meat is 90x% better in terms of water, etc., are based essentially on an unproven model. And our work has been very much around, providing those hydrolysates, the FBS replacements around, which would allow us to actually get to a situation where cell-based meat is environmentally sustainable. Next slide. Obviously, this has direct implications for space in terms of being able to put in the bioreactors that are there to be able to ensure that the vertical farming becomes more productive, that it produces better ingredients for making food. Next slide. And so that's where our algae extracts come in, and we've been doing a lot of work on using these extracts as biostimulants in hydroponic vertical farming. And what we basically showed is that using algae and even mycelial extracts, you get a healthier leafy green, and you also have longer shelf life, and they contain more flavonoids and antioxidants. And I think that the biggest part of the story is yet to come, because we're not playing games here. Long duration space travel requires row crops. It requires staple foods. It requires rice, wheat, corn, things you can ferment, you can make alcohol with, etc. And we believe that it is possible using algal and mycelial biostimulation to actually grow row crops at scale and sustainably and economically, both on Earth and in space. Next slide, please. And so another area of interest that one should bring up is the whole scope of the human microbiome. Space is a harsh environment. Diets tend to be can become very monotonous, and the microbiome is substantially affected by by long duration confinement in space, and we need to be fully aware of this as we look at the next slide, at the link between the microbiome and human health and well-being, and especially psychological well-being. And there is a growing focus on the use of probiotics for astronauts. But we do believe that the way that this will be managed is especially on the idea of using postbiotics and prebiotics. In other words, that there will be substrates to allow the gut to keep its normal microbiome in space, and algae and mycelia are very good at this. And postbiotics, in other words, ensuring that the food as it's digested starts to produce some of the micronutrients which are required for healthy, for physical and psychological well-being. Next slide. So one of the last issues I want to go into is the whole area of the fact that long duration space travel is not very good in terms of the kinds of stresses that it puts on people, on groups, etc. And this has been quite extensively studied. And next slide. And we think it's in this particular context that we need to look at the psychedelic renaissance. And I won't go into this, but there are a wide range of naturally derived psychoactive substances. Some of them are psychedelic, and we do believe that they would have some kind of a role in ensuring the health and well-being of space travelers. Next slide. And this is especially when you look at this whole issue of the gut and the brain axis. And this is where the whole area of neuroplasticity and the neurobiome come into play. Next slide. And neuroplasticity, and I won't go into this in great detail, but basically the way that our brains react to a range of stresses and recover from them is perhaps one of the most important aspects of ensuring that we can get people into space for long periods of time. Next slide. And neuroplasticity essentially relates to a thing called that the psychedelics are potential psychoplastogens. They increase synaptic spine density, they increase growth of the brain, and they create essentially new connections within the brain, which is supposed to be a major part of why the psychedelics such as psilocybin have now been shown to be effective in conditions such as treatment-resistant depression. Next slide. And it's obviously a bit of a controversial issue, to say the least, using these things on people, and it raises a whole range of bioethical issues. Next slide. And I just want to establish unequivocally the whole link with the cell culture, the cell-based meat. And this is work which we've done, where we've taken the Sonoran desert toad, Incilius alvarius, and that's one of our laboratory toads. I think it's Betty. And what we did is we biopsy the toads, we immortalize the cells, and we produce a thing called 5-methoxy-dimethyltryptamine, 5-MeO-DMT, which is probably the most powerful natural psychedelic that we have. And so this is a case where, this is pure cell-based cell culture. I'm not saying we should be eating 5-MeO-DMT cells, but maybe we could. But it is a case in point of where we would be doing cultured cells in space to produce a psychoactive drug, which has a lot of applications, which we'll look at in a second. Next slide. And so, so what were the applications? Well, I mean, essentially, how are we going to keep people physically and psychologically well for long periods of time, and manage things which range from death in space, the challenge of death in space, to the possibility of meeting extraterrestrial creatures or other forms of life. These are all things, and this is coming upon us pretty soon. I mean, perhaps within the next 5 years or so, there'll be a long duration space mission. Next slide. And so the people are looking at the challenge, and people are saying that we're going to have to put people to sleep for months and months. But that may not be the way to go, because actually, probably, we've been, as a species, we've been tripping and traveling and on shamanic journeys far long, for a pretty long time. So it may not be necessary to put people to sleep, but it's undoubtedly going to be necessary to find some kind of intervention to ensure that our psychological well-being and our group well-being, especially during space travel. Next slide. So essentially, we want to make the point that, without belaboring it, that psychedelics are associated with a journey. It may be the inner journey, whereas the space travel is the outer journey, and the deep. We will need help, certainly, to manage with the existential challenges of being in space, and improving our psychological and physical conditions as we engage on these long duration space journeys. Next slide. And in summary, we come back to what we said in the beginning, that to us, psychedelics, cell culture, bioregeneration is essentially the citrus fruit for what was the scurvy of long duration sea travel. And that we see that we could actually now, with the technologies we have, better leverage nature's algal and mycelial bounties to ensure that we are both physically and psychologically in a better state to do this most amazing thing, which is to travel into other galaxies and universes. Next slide. And thank you very much. That's Will, one of our technicians, holding a 100% plant-based burger. And we're always happy to dialogue and discuss further. And we look forward to speaking with anybody who wants to discuss bioregenerative and psychedelics in space. Thank you.
Wow, this was quite interesting. I have a couple questions, and mostly just kind of impressed, really. But I guess first off, you mentioned that your team was originally working on ag tech. When did you realize, like, oh, this could lead to psychedelics, and how is that process to say, hey, this is a great idea, let's move forward with it?
if you want to read the history, it's in shamanic. There's an article about it in Shamanic Plant Science and in Lucid News. And basically, what happened was it was a pure cell culture story. We discovered that that our algae extracts improve the growth of mycelia of mushrooms, and what we realized is that everybody else was busy trying to everybody was producing mushrooms. Mycelial mushrooms basically became a commodity in plant-based food, and our mycologists were avidly interested in psychedelics. And me, I'm a physician by training. I heard they kept talking to me about it, and then I started to read about it. And I said, hey, this is probably, a revolutionary thing in the in terms of biomedicine. So we started to work on the biotechnology side of it. And we were joined by my brother, who is a very, very well-known neuropsychopharmacologist and professor of psychiatry. And so now we're already in preclinical work with mycelial-based full spectrum therapeutics. So to us, it's a very it may sound strange, but it's a very, very natural evolution. It's cell-based, it's biostimulated, okay, and it happens to be therapeutic.
That's awesome. I love it. And I'm a huge fan of that example that you gave of kind of long distance travel is or long distance space travel is comparable to long distance travel on ships. And I think that was kind of a very interesting thing that I haven't heard before, but it totally makes sense. And I think that's a great analogy. I also liked kind of the connection between, having these types of long trips is not just important from a nutritional aspect, but psychological aspect. You did mention that, back to the psychedelics, you did mention that, there was that quote from somebody at NASA that we really need to get psychedelics in space. But how does the broader industry think about that? How do most people in the space industry think about psychedelics? Is this something that they're open to?
I have no idea. We've had no contact with people in the space industry, and we've published the psychedelics work now. It's on SSRN, and we've submitted it to a space engineering journal, and we think it's going to be published shortly. I think the problem is that people are very much in niches. Like we're not in the space business, so we have the liberty to think and do what we want. And our idea is we're going to lock somebody in a room with a whole bioregenerative system, and we're going to get it right. In other words, that the person could live from a totally bioregenerative system. But we're doing it because we can do it, and because we're interested in it, but we're not really part of the system. Look, I hope Elon Musk comes and knocks on my door and says, hey, you guys are doing something brilliant, but I don't think it's going to happen. I think we're just going to be regarded as crazies because we're not part of this whole system. And, honestly, like Groucho Marx said, do you really want to be part of a club that invites you to be part of the club? So we're quite happy with what we're doing, but we are very excited, and we do really think that this is a very sensible idea to look at the potential role of psychedelic. I haven't gone into things like microdosing and other things where we're obviously biotech people. We understand. We're looking at it from a very scientific point of view. So I've only gone into things which we really believe in, but there are other aspects of it which need to be explored.
Great. Yeah. And for those listening, if you are in the industry and this is something that's interesting, definitely reach out and, throw your comments in the channel. But lastly, I just want to close out by saying, thank you so much. And I love the connections to kind of, cell culture and everything that you guys are doing is quite interesting. I'd love to kind of dig into some of those publications. So I'll see if I can pull the links and put them in the description. But otherwise, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much for having us. And I wish you a great conference. Thank you.